So I could end up losing and losing over again and end up having to withdraw my money right at the wrong time, so I'm not actually achieving that expected interest rate. What is up, guys? This is Larry, and today I want to talk about a video that Graham just recently posted about a bank that's called Yotta Savings. Now, Graham is actually a recent investor in Yotta Savings, and if you know me or know this channel at all, you know that I like to talk about things from both perspectives, showing the pros and cons of different things. Now, I will say my goal here is not necessarily to bash Graham or bash Yotta Savings. My goal actually is to just kind of provide information and get people to think a little more critically. And I actually have always been a huge fan of Graham. I've watched him for years, and I actually really enjoy what Yotta Savings is doing because it's pushing the bounds of finance in an area that typically doesn't have much innovation. I think it's always important for people to understand the full picture, especially when you're dealing with something as personal as finance. For example, in Graham's recent video, he talked about how the big prize pot is this $10 million prize pot. But in reality, and this is straight from Yotta's website, it's a lump sum payment of $5.8 million. This is the present cash value of $10 million for a 40-year annuity. I also think by challenging different ideas out there, not only does it help people kind of see both sides, you can have the pros and the cons and weigh that out for your own decision, but also by critiquing ideas, you end up challenging them, and in some cases that may cause them to enhance and improve their ideas. Do I care if you end up using Yotta Savings or any other kind of prize-based saving system? Not necessarily, but at the same time, I'm not necessarily having some kind of vested interest, even a referral code that would prompt me to kind of push people or incentivize people to sign up for the program. An example of some of the risks that I'm talking about, which I'll touch more on later, but is this expected average return that constantly gets talked about. And part of the issue is that it assumes that the expected return, or that these prize pots are going to stay consistent throughout time, but as even in Graham's own video kind of alluded to, that may not actually necessarily be the case, that these prizes, or at least the effective average interest rate that they're talking about, may have to drop, which we've already seen that over the past few months for Yotta Savings. Now, I will say that I have studied prize-linked savings account because it was part of my behavioral economics courses that I ended up taking in my undergrad. And on top of that, it's a topic that I really enjoy talking about, and I talk about throughout this channel, how behavioral concepts and psychology ends up influencing finance as well. Now, even with that said, I will say that all of these things I'm going to say are just my opinion. I'm not necessarily a financial advisor. I'm not necessarily trying to bash Yotta Savings or bash Graham or anything like that. But I was surprised and excited that Graham was talking about this because it touches on behavioral finance and economics, which is, things I talk about on this channel. Do I think somebody out there can give a fair analysis, even though they're an investor in the program? Absolutely. But at the same time, we have to be aware of some of these inherent biases that we may not necessarily be aware of. For example, a lot of the people that are promoting Yotta Savings right now end up getting this referral bonus, and this referral bonus ends up kind of increasing the odds in their favor, whereas you and me aren't necessarily getting that bonus on a consistent basis, whereas they are. So what could happen is that somebody that has these referral bonuses that consistently get better odds than, say, just an average person, they may end up having these feelings or sentiments that they tend to think that the odds are a lot greater than they actually are. And speaking of referrals, something to at least consider is that if everybody is signing up initially, getting these bonus tickets, you end up having better odds and more winnings early on, so then you end up having this great response towards Yotta Savings or just any kind of prize-linked savings account. So then you end up seeing, for example, 5-star reviews on the app because initially it does seem like a great idea, and that's why the word of mouth for this company and different companies ends up working out so well, is because you end up having this bonus increased interest rate that you're getting that you wouldn't actually expect over the long run. Now, why do I want people to think a little bit more critically of this is because if you consider just, for example, Yotta Savings, and I'm not necessarily going to just specifically talk about them, but in general for Yotta Savings, if you have to withdraw your money, there are certain limitations. Graham kind of talked about it being 10 days. On their website, they listed about 1 to 3 days, and then you can only do 6 withdrawals per month. And on top of that, there's a limit of $40,000. So what I wouldn't want to have people happen is basically you end up having your savings tied up somewhere when you actually need it. Now, if you have a pretty good understanding as far as how price-linked based savings account work, you can go ahead and skip to the next marker, but I'm going to explain it and kind of simplify the math here so that we can begin to understand how it works as well as some of the problems that may arise. Think about a bank that gives you 10% interest on $100 that you deposit with them, and that's a guaranteed rate. Now compare this with a price-linked savings account where this could kind of fluctuate. You may end up getting no money in return, but on the opposite opposite end, you could also get a 20% return on that money. Since in this case, the prize link savings account isn't necessarily paying you interest, it basically takes your deposits and gives it with another bank, and then it accrues interest on that other bank. So then it ends up pulling this money, this interest that it's gaining by not necessarily giving you any interest, and then it ends up generating this pot of money that you could have a percent chance to win. So let's say this pot of money ends up being $20 and you won that $20, then you got a 20% interest on your money that you deposited with them. So that's a better interest rate than say the 10% guaranteed interest rate that you would have got with the other bank. But let's say you're not necessarily playing this game alone, you're playing it with somebody else. So let's say you both end up winning the prize money, you end up splitting it, so $10 each. And there's going to be some cases where you don't win it and they win it, or that you win it all and they win nothing. So in the end, over time, you do end up getting the same interest rate. You end up getting $10. So given enough time, in the long run, you may win out, or you may actually have the same effective interest rate. But here's where the problem gets tricky in the short run. I'm going to share a quick story where I had this behavioral economics professor, and she ran this experiment and asked everybody in the class to go back home and flip a coin 100 times and to write down heads or tails on a piece of paper, and that we would just turn in that sheet of paper as our assignment as proof that we flipped a coin 100 times. Now, flipping a coin is pretty tedious 100 times to do, and it's pretty easy just to make up, heads, tails, and just turn that in. There's not necessarily any other proof than the sheet of paper, so it's pretty easy to make up. To everyone's surprise, at the end of the assignment, once everybody's assignment was turned in, she was able to not only predict everybody who did complete it correctly, but she was able to accurately predict to the T as far as every single person that ended up lying. So how did she do this? Well, everybody knows as far as flipping a coin that the odds of getting heads or tails is 50-50 chance. So in your mind, when you're going to cheat and write 100 times heads or tails, the odds of writing 5 times heads in a row just kind of seems absurd. The odds of you right now flipping a coin 5 times and landing heads 5 times in a row is actually less than 5%, but given enough times of this game and you keep repeating this game, let's say 100 times, there's pretty much a guarantee that you're actually going to, at a minimum, have 5 heads in a row. Well, I guess I should say either having 5 heads in a row or 5 tails in a row. So given the odds as far as me right now flipping heads 5 times in a row versus the odds of me flipping heads, tails, heads is actually the same, even though conceptually it seems like the heads 5 times in a row is less likely, which is the whole problem, right? We're bad at conceptualizing statistics, which is kind of how certain companies kind of take advantage of this principle, which is what I'll continue to talk about in this video. You see, this professor was able to spot the cheaters because she knew that they weren't going to write heads more than 5 times in a row or tails 5 times in a row. So that's how she was able to predict the cheater. You could actually run the same experiment too. Just find a random number generator out there. I'll link one down below in the description, but basically just set the numbers, the outcomes to 1 and 2 and run it 100 times, and you will find that not only will you get heads at least 5 times in a row or tails 5 times in a row, but in some cases you can even get up to as much as 10 times in a row. You see, this gets at what's known as the law of small numbers versus the law of large numbers. Basically, if you flip a coin only 2 or 3 times, you may end up getting heads or tails more times than you would think because the odds don't actually line up the way they would if you ran this game 100 times. Over 100 times, you may have 49 heads and 51 tails, but if you end up running it just 5 times, you may get heads 4 times in a row. So getting back at this prize link savings account, it kind of ends up working out the same way. Sure, the expected value in this scenario could end up being $10 if I deposit $100, but somebody out there could end up winning $20 every single time, and I could end up losing 4, 5, 6 times in a row. So why is this a problem? Well, it means that to get the expected return, not only does the prize and the expected return have to remain the same throughout time, but it also means that I have to be able to leave my money in there and not necessarily withdraw it at the exact wrong moment. So I could end up losing and losing over again and end up having to withdraw my money right at the wrong time, so I'm not actually achieving that expected interest rate. So I really want this to be understood that the worst case scenario is not necessarily that you have to split the earnings or winnings with other people, that the worst case scenario is that you end up having to withdraw your money right at the wrong time. And Graham kind of somewhat addresses this a little bit in his video when he talks about that, sure, there's going to be some people that get a higher interest rate than the expected average interest rate, and there are going to certainly be losers that end up getting, a lower interest rate. But the thing is you could end up getting that lower interest rate and having to withdraw your money, whereas you would have been better off getting a guaranteed expected return at a different bank. Plus, there's also this problem with the referral bonus that a lot of people get. If I get 100 free tickets on my first week, then my winnings actually may kind of skew the numbers a little bit. So my winnings may end up being $3, but a lot of that's attributed to those $100 bonus tickets. So then I end up multiplying that by 52 and thinking, well, that's a better interest rate, or that's a better return on my money than any other, regular savings account out there. But the problem with that, though, is that you're skewing the number, or skewing the statistics by that first week, because you have those 100 bonus tickets that you won't have throughout time. So let's go back to this idea for a moment as far as the different type of people that would be able to put $1,000 in this, prize link savings account and leave it there long enough that they can get that effective interest rate, versus the type of people that may end up having to withdraw it at the exact wrong moment. Most likely, the person that's going to end up having to withdraw it in the short run is probably somebody that probably really needs the money, right? And what's even a little worrisome as well is if there ends up being this fee to basically withdraw your money at a quicker rate, because these people that end up having a $1,000 emergency and have to withdraw that money quickly, they're the types of people that would pay that fee because they need that money. Or even worse is that you think about, behavioral economics is about how people think irrationally in these extremes. So you think about the people that are, that gambling appeals to, they may not necessarily have the best financial literacy. So what may end up happening is they actually end up leaving that $1,000 in that prize link savings account and end up having some other higher interest method, for example, using a credit card to fund an emergency. And that may seem pretty absurd at first, but when you think about the power of fear and the power of FOMO, you don't necessarily want to miss out. That's how gambling, that's why it works so well, that's why it's addictive, is because you start to tell yourself that this next time actually might be the time I win. So then you end up putting money again. You end up doubling down in some cases because you're just so convinced that this next time may win, which also touches on this other bias that we have, which is kind of known as the availability bias. But all I'll say here is basically that people tend to think that they're more likely to win a lottery because they deserve it. They think about their grandmother that they could help pay, their medical bills for, or that they could pay off their brother or father's, house, and that they could finally retire. And you think that these reasons that you deserve the lottery better ends up increasing your odds in some weird way. Another example of this would be people rushing out to go to the lottery because they saw the lottery and people winning lottery and, having these great stories on the news. If I see it on the news more and more of people winning this prize pot, I start to feel like, it's more likely that I could win, versus if I never watch the news and I never see anybody win the lottery, or I've never even heard of anybody winning the lottery, then I start to think that the odds of me winning aren't that likely at all, which is actually probably the case. That's also why these prize link, business operations kind of are interesting, because what ends up happening is the word of mouth is so powerful, right? So I end up winning this prize pot because I had these bonus tickets. I end up getting this 5% return. I tell you about it compared to your measly 0.8% return. And so it gets you excited about the potential winnings because you saw me win it, somebody that you know. And so you end up going out there and thinking that the odds are more likely when they're really not. This idea works the same way as far as when you see a bad wreck right in front of you. All of a sudden you start driving a lot better. You start driving a lot, slower, because you think, oh, I don't want to get in a wreck, even though the odds of you getting in a wreck were just as likely before you saw the wreck versus after. It's the same thing. So you should, in theory, have the same driving skills or the same driving mentality before and after the wreck. But we see that that's not the case. This whole issue is even more prevalent when you think about something that's known as a poverty trap, which basically you just think about somebody living paycheck to paycheck and that they're desperate for a new car, and that, their whole life would be so much better if they could afford a new car, but they're not going to get that by putting their $1,000 emergency fund in a 1% interest rate savings account, but they might benefit from a new car. And so that idea ends up being a lot more exciting. So even though that there's this really, really small chance that they're going to win, the idea, the dream of it is just so powerful that it ends up kind of skewing these odds. And if you don't believe me on this, think about this. If I said, do you want to go on this boat ride? There's a 0% chance that this boat would sink. You'd be like, all right, sounds great. But if I said to a general population and said, do you want to go on this boat ride? There's a 0.01% chance that the boat may sink. That's pretty powerful. Even though it's a very minuscule amount, a very minuscule percent, it ends up having a pretty powerful impact. But yet, if I ask those people that were willing to go on the boat ride at a 0.01% chance that the boat may sink, and I tell them, hey, actually, I recalculate the odds, and there's actually a 4% chance that this boat may sink, you would find that not a lot of people are going to change their minds, that 4% versus 0 or 0.01% chance that the boat may sink ends up being about the same in their mind. But yet, what did have a more powerful effect is that 0% to that 0.01% chance. So that little tiny bit of hope ends up making a big difference. Okay, so who cares about, people miscalculating odds or any of these different principles if the effective average interest rate in the long run truly is higher than the interest rate you would find at a regular bank at 1%, for example? Well, you still have to address that issue that in the short run that you may end up having a lower interest rate because you have to withdraw it. But there's also this other issue of you're expecting that the prize pot will end up being the same or that the odds will be the same. Now, here's kind of my two main predictions that I have. One being that the interest rate will eventually have to come down, which, I don't think anybody is trying to hide. I think everybody kind of shows that at this high of an interest rate is basically to gain momentum. At some point, it's going to have to drop. And so you kind of ask yourself, well, how are they able to offer such a high interest rate at an industry that's really competitive? The banking world is very competitive, very thin margins. So I think really the answer is that they basically have a high cash burn rate, which basically they're coming out, they're finding investments, they're finding this cash infusion that basically allows them to boost its interest rate temporarily, but over the long run, they're going to have to drop it. Now, that's fine if you don't necessarily believe me, but you can just go ahead and look at how the UK premium bonds work, which is something that's been referenced as far as how these prize-linked savings account work, is if you go look at those rates and those interest rates, they aren't actually at these 3 or 4% interest rates that we're seeing. They're actually more at about like 1.5, 1.7% interest rate. But something that I think that is kind of different as far as the UK market is that those interests, I believe my understanding anyways, is that it's taxed, it's not necessarily taxed, that interest rate that you're accruing from these prized accounts. But, in the US market, that may be a little bit different. That's not necessarily too clear. What I'd imagine is going to happen is that the savings bonus, so the interest rate, the 0.2% interest rate you're getting, is going to be taxed as interest income versus these bonus amounts are actually going to be taxed as miscellaneous income or some other form of taxes. So that may have to be a factor as far as when you're calculating this average effective interest rate is how those taxes actually play out. Now, the other prediction I have here is that the interest rate is going to have to drop because the base is going to continue to increase, right? As more people begin to use it, then the odds of me winning that, $10 million or $5.8 million prize pot will end up being, the likelihood anyways, is that I'm going to have to split it with other people. That's going to become more and more likely, so that average effective interest rate begins to drop. Now, who cares if the interest rate is going to drop in the future if right now it is, an expected average higher interest rate than, say, at a regular bank? Well, I think part of the argument that I'm trying to make here is that if we know the interest rate is going to decrease down the road, then you can't really you have to factor that into this expected average that you're calculating over the course of, 52 weeks, for example. Like I said, you could end up in the scenario where you end up losing when the interest rate is high, but once they begin to have a bigger base, or for example, they begin to decrease these prize pots, then that's actually when you end up starting to win. And that's, unfortunate, because then your expected average earnings actually ends up being a lot lower than you thought it would. And perhaps that would have changed your decision in the beginning. Now, another prediction I actually do have that I want to add is that eventually they're going to have to introduce new products to basically keep the interest rate competitive, or, try to keep it even more competitive and with other banks and keep it at a higher interest rate. And I think one of the ways they're going to do that is either by introducing some kind of debit card, for example, because like I said, if you're thinking about these people that end up having to withdraw their money really quick, a debit card is a great option. That's a really great option to still bank with, Yotta Savings, for example, and still be able to withdraw my money fairly quickly. So, that's definitely something that may be a consideration. Now, to kind of support that argument, I think probably the best example is if you take a look at Chime Bank, which basically they offer a pretty decent interest rate, but they don't necessarily have any fees or anything like that, but they do offer a debit card. And because everybody uses their debit card, they end up charging a merchant fee. So on the merchant side, they're being charged 2%, and that's basically how Chime Banks makes its money. So I kind of foresee that might be possible as well with Yotta Savings. Basically, I kind of envision that they're trying to build up a base. They basically have this gambling aspect that ends up kind of locking in or building a lot of interest. So then now that you have that base, you end up offering this debit card and end up making a lot of money on the merchant end. I also think another potential option too is that they use your data and basically sell it to third-party advertisers. The only reason I kind of speculate this a little bit is I was reading on Yotta Savings website, for example, and there is basically some talk as far as if you did win that $5.8 million prize pot, that basically you do have to sign some kind of disclosure that, your name is going to become public information. I'm not necessarily I'm not necessarily a lawyer or anything like that, so I don't necessarily know the legal jargon too well, but that definitely is something worth mentioning. I also thought worth mentioning as well that, it is true that Yotta Savings has, many venture capitalists and different type of people backing them, which is great and all, but I also just wanted to talk for a moment as far as how venture capitalists tend to work, which is in general, this is just a generality, but you think about Shark Tank, for example, Kevin O'Leary will basically make 10 different bets, right? He knows that not necessarily all 10 companies are going to be out of the park winners, but he knows that the one that does win is just going to blow it out of the park, and that the profits generated from that one company are going to be enough to offset the losses from different companies. So venture capitalists tend to end up kind of investing in a lot of different companies. I'm not necessarily saying that's the case for Yotta Savings. I'm just saying that just because a company has backing does not necessarily mean that it's a guaranteed win or that's going to be a guaranteed, hit out of the park. The other two potential problems I at least wanted to mention out there so that people can be aware of is, one, the idea that they may increase in numbers as far as their lottery and how that lottery system works, because basically it ends up diluting the odds. And that's already been done just recently. So, it's not necessarily a bad sign or anything like that. I'm just at least letting people know that when people begin to add numbers to a lottery system, there's basically no reason why they can't add more and more numbers. The second thing I want to mention that I think is kind of interesting that people have to think about is basically abstracting the value as far as these different prize pots. So for example, if I say, right now the prize pot is $30,000, but then I end up changing that and saying that, it's a car, for example, which is what Yotta Savings recently did. And that ends up abstracting the value. So if I'm somebody who desperately needs a car, then I end up thinking that $30,000 prize pot is actually worth more than $30,000. It's the same thing that they used to do on The Price is Right all the time. The other issue with this is that it makes it kind of easier to devalue the prize pot over time without people not necessarily knowing, right? So the prize pot is $30,000 and that equals a Tesla, and that may be fair value, but over time that Tesla may not necessarily be $30,000. But because initially that association was made, the $30,000 on the Tesla, then in your mind, you always associate that Tesla as $30,000, even though over time it actually may decrease in value. Now, the other thing I wanted to address is kind of more of a philosophical type question as far as how these prize-linked savings account in a generality kind of work and operate, and some of the inherent flaws that they may have. If you think about like I said, the type of people it attracts, you may end up getting an effective average interest rate of, let's just say, let's be generous and say 4%. Then, that may attract a certain type of people, but other people that tend to be wealthier or richer may see other opportunities elsewhere. They may see the fact that you can generate an average return from the stock market or an index fund at 7% or even 5%, 6%. So you end up kind of developing this wealth gap even more and more, because what ends up happening is that basically, people who aren't necessarily financially literate end up just kind of banking on the fact that these prize-based savings account are the best way to go. And I understand the whole argument as far as, the fact that these people would not have saved that money otherwise. So they are winning in the end. It's a net positive for them. And that may be absolutely true. But one thing to kind of consider is, if I end up basically being tricked into making a savings account, am I becoming more financially independent and literate, or am I basically destined to basically never learn and develop those skills on my own? Especially because some people end up having to learn the hard way, right? When you hit rock bottom and you're broke and you're trying to figure out how to pay off $100,000 in debt, that may be the call to action to basically get your act together and start learning about personal finance. But if I'm basically tricked into, not necessarily tricked, but if these behavioral finance ideas cause me to save and I'm not necessarily learning on my own, then that actually may pose a problem in the long run. Now, just a few other things I kind of want to address as well. And like I said, I'm not necessarily trying to bash on Yotta Savings or basically any prize-linked savings account. I think that they, have its uses, and I definitely think it's, interesting to experiment. As far as like economics and my personal, finance belief, I think experimentation is always a great thing. I think we can test things, see how they work, and then reevaluate. So I'm not necessarily, fully discounting this whole entire program. But one thing to consider is this whole referral code type bonus. Well, I don't necessarily think it's like the biggest problem in the world. And I think I'd be pretty curious to find out the proportion of referral bonus tickets that, these big names are getting because they're basically endorsing the product on, their YouTube channel or whatever it may be. I think it'd be pretty interesting, but I think it kind of might create this problem because as a regular individual, I continuously basically am diluting my odds, right? As just an example, as Graham begins to increase his referral bonuses more and more and more, his odds become, ever increasing, versus my odds don't just stay this, they're not staying the same. They're actually decreasing because he's getting more bonus tickets. And so are the other people that are getting that first time $100 referral bonus. Now, I do just want to add here real quick about the whole idea of lucky numbers. While I do think that's certainly a fun aspect, I do think one has to consider that when you add lucky numbers and you basically ask everybody, 1,000 people, what their lucky numbers are, you will find that certain numbers tend to be more common than others. For example, 7 tends to be the most common, lucky number that people use. 13 or 3 or 12 are also really great examples of lucky numbers that most people have. So what I'd recommend here is, while this is kind of a fun, interesting aspect, I kind of do wonder if one of the benefits to doing that is that basically you're guaranteeing that when somebody does win the prize pot, that it's going to be split amongst more people. So what I recommend to people is, if you are going to choose numbers, to basically just use random generated numbers, not necessarily lucky numbers. Now, the other thing I think is at least worth mentioning, and I'm not necessarily saying that this is any problem at all, but I think it's at least worth acknowledging that the current CEO of Yotta Savings, the founder anyways, his father he runs this investment bank, is actually founder of this investment bank, and that's actually one of the backings of Yotta Savings. So why do I kind of mention that? I think it'd be pretty interesting to figure out the amount of cash that's coming, being funneled through that investment bank. Is that a problem? I don't necessarily think it's a problem at all. I just think it's something that at least needs to be thrown out there. Whether or not that makes you feel more or less comfortable as far as using Yotta Savings, that's your call, but I thought it at least should be acknowledged. And this information is certainly disclosed very clearly on their website, so once again, props for them for that. And to Yotta Savings credit, as well as, just the general website over there, you can go on that website and find a ton of information, a ton of stuff that they disclose. So I definitely think that's great, but I do think there is always this kind of question as far as, how can we know that they're not necessarily going to try to change the prize pools at any other point, or that they're not going to, add numbers the moment that I jump into the program or that you jump into the program? So that's kind of something I would like to see more of, is basically a guarantee that the prize pool will stay at this certain amount for this duration of time. That's how the UK premium bonds program works, is that, in December, I believe pretty soon, that they're going to change the interest rate or the prize that they're giving. So, they disclose that ahead of time, versus app type program. I'm not necessarily seeing that the prize is guaranteed to stay for a certain duration of time, which, if you're trying to calculate a true expected average interest rate that everybody's talking about, you have to have this interest rate to stay steady, because otherwise, if it changes throughout time, or you can add numbers to the lottery pool, then it's not necessarily a true average effective interest rate. It's only a temporary average effective interest rate. At the end of the day, if you still want to try the app, that's fine with me. I'm just here to basically kind of provide other side, right? A critique of it, so that way you can understand the inherent risks of a prize-linked savings account. And so if you still want to use it, that's totally fine. And if not, that's fine as well. And if by the craziest chance that Graham is watching this video, I'd love to have a conversation more about behavioral finance economics, perhaps even addressing some of these different concerns that I'm bringing up. But if not, I'd love to just talk about behavioral finance in general. And, that's it for this video. And if you like behavioral finance or economics, consider subscribing to this video. If not, that's totally fine as well. I'm glad I had you for this video and for this long. And if you want to hit that like button because you appreciate this video, I'd more than appreciate it. And once again, this is just totally my opinion and my critique. I'm not necessarily a financial advisor or anything like that. And I hope to see you in the next one.